The next point he makes here is that compassion is owed to those who are psychologically vulnerable. And this is where I think that I've heard a lot of Christians miss it. There is a big difference between people who are using this idea for harm, saying, well, okay, if I can identify however I want, then I'm going to identify this way and go into a locker room or go into this. Like, there's people that are just misusing this in horrible ways and causing a lot of damage. But if we imagine that all transgender individuals fall into that core category, then we will do a lot of harm, because there are individuals that are truly have gender confusion, gender dysphoria, that are suffering angst and anxiety and depression as a result of this incongruence between their biological sex and their gender identity and how they view themselves. And these are individuals that I have talked to that have struggled to make sense of it and have deep like angst. And I can tell you tons of stories if you want to hear some of people who come up just pure, like just truly disturbed and troubled trying to make sense of it. And so if we act as if all people are just misusing this idea to cause harm and destruction on whatever, that's just not the case. And so we have to recognize that there are individuals who actually do have gender dysphoria, where there's an actual anxiety and a disconnect between how they see themselves and their biological self that cause an issue that has to be dealt with. Where when they say, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body, that's a genuine disconnect that is causing this angst. And he writes here, these individuals are owed compassion, mercy, and gentleness, not mockery, scorn, or contempt. And I completely agree. And this is where Christians sometimes have to get better. When we joke about transgenderism and we go, oh, and we just say these flippant jokes, then we're lumping it all together into one. And when we do that, and people are sitting in the audience or standing around you and hear that, then that is how they view themselves within a Christian view. And look, I don't know about you, but for me, many times I've had Christians talk about theological issues or cultural issues or scientific issues that I personally hold to as being the most ridiculous, dumb, stupid thing that anyone could possibly ever hold, because they're not even aware that I hold that. They just assume that they're in with their in-group, that everyone thinks like them. And so we get a lot more loose with how we talk. We get a lot more, we check our language less. And that's natural. And we have to recognize that this happens. I've had people just absolutely hate on old earth creationism in front of me. How can you believe that Christians think this? How ridiculous, denying the Bible. And I'm like, I'm one of them. I've had people say, can you believe that some Christians think that you can't lose your salvation? And I'm like, yep, I'm one of those that think you can't. There's a lot of theological, cultural issues that I hold to that I've heard people talk about in this way. And so to actually recognize that, hey, maybe other people think differently and are listening, and maybe we have to actually stop and think about how we speak matters, because we don't want to be mocking people who think differently. And so I think that's a really, really important point that he draws here. Last 2 points he says the beauty of the Christian worldview surrounding questions of transgenderism is the sufficiency of the Christian worldview. What he means by this is that the meta-narrative, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, is the underlying storyline of Scripture that allows us to understand God's original plan, doctrine of creation, why things are not as they should be, the fall, how the gospel empowers us to live lives of holiness in a broken creation, redemption, and where our ultimate hope lies, restoration. I mean, that's why the Christian meta-narrative, creation, fall, redemption, restoration is so important. One thing I always say when I talk about this issue is the doctrine of the fall gives us a backstage pass into understanding why people feel the way they do, and should make Christians the most compassionate people on the planet, because we actually have that explanation why there's disconnect, why there's brokenness, why there are issues in our culture. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So that's something that we have to think about. Now, to give a deeper dive into this point of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, I would love to offer you the paper that I wrote. So my paper on a theology of the body and transgenderism walks through this specifically. And I look at this topic of our bodies and gender in light of the biblical meta-narrative. Okay, well, how does creation speak into this topic? How does the fall inform us and help us become more compassionate and understanding of why things are what they are? In redemption, I go into the gospel and how the gospel is good news for our bodies. And then in redemption, I address. All right, I'm back again. All right, I'm back again. Don't know where I cut off, but I was giving a shameless plug for you to sign up for my training letter, because if you do, you will get a link that then you can download my paper on a theology of the body and transgenderism. If you don't want to download that paper, or you don't want to sign up for my training letter, then you can just shoot me a message and I'd be happy to share that link with you for you to download my paper and see how the biblical meta-narrative of creation, fall, redemption, restoration is actually wonderful news for this topic. The last thing that he addresses here is that intersex conditions do not disprove a gender binary. Am I back? Guys, I don't know what's happening right now. Successfully connected. All right, I think I'm back. Let's see if it comes up over here really quick before I move on. All right, it looks like I'm back. Okay. So this is, I don't know what's going on in my house. I didn't tell you guys the full story. Maybe I did before I left, but it's been insane over here. We had a water leak that led to mold, that led to our walls getting ripped out, that led to our carpet getting ripped out, that led to a remediation company having to come in to dry everything out for like 8 days that we couldn't live here. And then I got back from Utah to a house that had holes in walls and no carpet. And so starting on Monday, this is why the stream is happening Thursday. Starting Monday, I had drywall people coming in, fixing my drywall. And then they painted on Tuesday, and I had a carpet guy install my carpet on Wednesday. This morning, my father-in-law came to put down new baseboards and reconnect my tile. And I thought my house was ready to go, and now my internet doesn't work. Oh, it's just one thing after another. All right, let's hope that this keeps happening. So he talks about people's claims of why or that intersex conditions disprove a gender binary. And he says there's 3 things that we have to consider in response. Number 1, he says the intersex conditions are medically verifiable and diagnosable, whereas claims that someone is transgender are not. All right, so if our gender identity is based on psychology, then intersex conditions can in no sense argue against gender, because gender is a psychological state that you can only know what someone's gender identity is by asking them. And many in the culture will make this argument. In order to know what someone is, you have to ask them, how do you identify? What are your pronouns? And without asking that question, you can't actually know what someone is. And so then to assume that intersex conditions, which are biological and physical, speak into this issue assumes that gender is based on biology. And so this would be a good question to ask if someone is trying to use an intersex condition to argue against gender binary. Is say, okay, so based on intersex, are you now arguing that gender is biological and has a biological foundation that intersex conditions speak into? Oh no, gender is purely psychological, has nothing to do with biology. Okay, well then intersex conditions don't matter. They only matter if your biological sex, in which intersex deals with, actually has a connection to your gender. I think this is something that people often don't talk about. I think is a really good point that he makes here. Number 2, he says intersex conditions are a recognition of a problem that exists against a typical medical standard. These conditions are actually serve to reaffirm the abiding authority of gender binary by recognizing a deviation from it. So again, we recognize in our culture that it's just that we often know something is wrong because we know how it should be. We know that humans should have 2 legs. If you don't, something has gone wrong. If you see a person with only 1 leg, you know something traumatic happened to them either in birth or after birth, because this is how something should be. Just because there is a abnormality or something that there's a problem that exists does not mean that that problem now becomes a norm in which this is how things should be. He then lastly argues, number 3, despite ambiguities in anatomy, the majority of individuals who are intersex do not have confusion over whether they are male or female once chromosomes and other primary and secondary sex characteristics are discovered. So maybe just by visual, it's hard to tell. That's a very, very small minority. Most you can tell, but it is hard to tell. There's other ways to determine it. Now, some will point to chromosomes, and where I've argued before that can be problematic is there's chromosomal abnormalities that can be difficult. And that's why I would argue often, and many others as well, I've taken their argument and I would agree with them, that it doesn't produce either, but it has that orientation towards, or that's what it should do if it is functioning properly. And so because there are only 2 gametes, sperm or egg, there's not a spectrum, there's not an in-between. If gender and biological sex is based upon gamete production, then we can say that there really is a true gender-sex binary that then informs everything else. And so those are some of the points that he makes as far as the transgender individuals. So to finish off, he provides some basic biblical theological truths that every parent should know. He says this: number 1, the body's overall organization for reproduction is the most comprehensive way to account for male and female identity. Number 2, sex does not exist on a spectrum, but is binary, what I just mentioned there. Number 3, the transgender revolution requires individuals to believe falsehoods about human nature. Number 4, he argues that if you abandon the biological basis of male and female, you must adopt absurd and contradictory claims to define what a man or a woman is, or be, I think, unwilling to define them at all. Next, gender expression, while distinct from biological sex, cannot be severed from it, right? That our gender expression should flow from our biological sex, not completely separated from it. That men have an expression as male and women have an expression as female. Next, we have a duty to love those reporting to a perceived gender identity conflict. And lastly, intersex conditions are not a third sex, nor do they prove that sex exists on a spectrum.